A very warm welcome to you from Pakhuis de Zwijger. Welcome to another episode of Designing Cities for All. Designing Cities for All, of course, is our 2-year-long activity and research program in which we take a deep dive into designing products, places and systems for all. This livecast is the first of a 3-part livecast called Transitioning Together. And these 3 livecasts are co-curated by our Designing Cities for All Fellows Dark Matters Lab. Today we will talk about what it takes to design a climate-resilient and thriving future for all, of course. We are about to take a long, sometimes hard look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what are we facing? To introduce the topics of today and to dive deeper into the theme, I would like to give the floor to our Designing Cities for All Fellows Dark Matters Lab, and a warm welcome to you, Joost Beundermans and Indy Johar. A very warm welcome to you, I can say.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to explore these tough topics together. And I just wanted to do some very short framing before welcoming our fantastic guests, Agni and Giulio. And really, I think we wanted to start our triptych, which focuses on this transition question with acknowledging some hard-home truths, right? Even if countries meet the commitments made under the Paris Agreement, the world is heading currently for a 3.2 degrees Celsius global temperature rise, and we might actually hit that watershed 1.5 degree rise in the next 5 years once the UN Weather Agency. Those are some of the core truths that we feel without acknowledging that and without putting those front and center, we cannot meaningfully talk about designing cities for all. And we're getting closer to a series of tipping points. Those tipping points are around the Arctic, the Antarctic, the oceans, the Amazon. Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research says that increasingly it's clear that these tipping points are connected. We know that the Amazon is close to the tipping point of turning into a savanna instead of a carbon-storing forest. And we know that all the news is in that sense bad, right? The sea ice across much of the Arctic is thinning much faster than we think. And so every time new research comes up, it confirms the fact that we're on a sliding pathway. And it's not just climate research saying this, right? It's also Swiss Re, the reinsurance company. And they say that actually climate change is the biggest long-term risk to the global economy, which moreover is highly uneven, right? Southeast Asia is much, much more at compound risk than Western Europe through a combination of direct impact and ability to cope. So we're seeing accelerating negative impact. We're seeing a growing series of pieces of evidence on the highly uneven impact. And then we see what it does to cities, right? Sea level rises put cities at risk, which is, of course, a human and a natural world potential tragedy, but also leads to, again, impacts on the economy, right? Real estate being increasingly harder to insure, which in turn has impact on the security of communities. Heat stress, right? Extreme heat is one of the deadliest potential impacts of climate change, and is already being confirmed that more than a third of all heat-related deaths around the world can be attributed to human-induced global heating. In some cases, like Iran, Kuwait, Philippines, Thailand, this goes up to 50%. And beyond deaths, it's also straining health services, it's causing power outages, it's buckling railways, it's decreasing productivity, it's decreasing people's ability to learn, it's causing domestic violence, right? The impact of heat. And so those are the things that we're seeing, that all of us can see, right? And in the context of all of this, of course, we have the G7 summit. We have the COP conference in Glasgow coming up later in the year. We've seen a lot of further and further sort of more ambitious targets for carbon cutting. But we also see what seems like a huge amount of either business as usual or really slow and timid change, right? And that gap is the one that we want to explore together over the next couple of sessions in this triptych. The cognitive dissonance between what we know we are facing and what we know we have to do, and the speed and scope of transition required, and what we're actually seeing on the ground, which is, again, incrementalism or business as usual in too many instances, right? And so, health warning about tonight. This is not the good news evening, right? Which you may have noticed already. But we feel it's necessary. If we're going to talk designing cities for all, we cannot shy away from the degree of risk that we're facing. And we want to kind of give you two lenses on that, right? First by Agni Kalfagiani, which is a topical lens, right? A topical lens, food systems to make it tangible. And secondly, as Giulio Cuadro is very uniquely well placed to do, to really talk about the interconnected systems challenge that this faces, because it's those kind of insights that enable us, we think, to level with each other about the scope and the scale of the challenges we're facing, and therefore, what does transitioning together really mean, right? Because that's what we said in our first interview about a month ago. The transitions has to be inclusive, or it cannot be happening democratically, right? So let's start with some of that future risk. At that point, handing over, unless, Indy, do you want to add anything to that setting of the scene?
No, just a brief thing, which is that I think one of the key things is the honesty of the debate. And that too often the debate has been captured by kind of the perception of politics and let's make things positive because actually then people will change. But actually in that has been a falsification of reality. And I think one of the key challenges that we face is that we seem to be fighting the marketing idea of the problem as opposed to the problem itself and the scale of the problem as it manifests. So the question is, how do we have an honest idea of the transition that we face in Europe? And then we look at it from a systems lens, because it won't be solved all in Europe. It'll have to be solved at multiple layers across it. So, and recognizing this is just a symptom, climate change is just a symptom of the problem, not the problem itself. It's a symptom of the problem. And that's a structural question at the center of it. So yeah, I'm really excited about this evening. Thanks, yes.
Great. Wow. Well, great, not so great. You've raised some worrying questions that we will discuss further here in the studio. And I would like to introduce our next guest, who I'm going to do that. Agni Kalfagiani, welcome, a warm welcome to you. You're an associate professor of transitional sustainability governance at the University of Utrecht. Thank you for joining us in the studio. We heard quite a gloom future. We heard some hard truths where the temperatures are rising 3.2 degrees Celsius, where several tipping points are being met at the Arctic, at the Amazon, turning into a savanna, where climate change is the biggest risk, but not evenly distributed, where Southeast Asia takes a bigger risk than Europe. In this passage of doom and gloom, what's your take on the problem that we're facing?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me and to speak about this important issue. I would like to bring a perspective from the food systems because it's a prime example of the interconnected planetary failures that we have induced as human beings and we are also facing. And starting with climate, agriculture, forestry and other land contributes to about 1/4 of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And about half of these emissions come from animal husbandry, in particular keeping cows and sheep. But at the same time, climate change has huge implications for how we feed ourselves and for food security. The Food and Agriculture Organization, for instance, notes that a warming planet will have cascading effects that will compromise each of the 4 pillars of food security, which are food availability, access, utilization, and stability. And just to make that a bit more concrete, if you think about wheat, rice, maize, and soybean, so these provide about 2/3 of human caloric intake. And with every degree Celsius of increase, the productivity of these seeds is going to be reduced on an average between 3 and 7%.
What does that concrete mean?
And this means that with a 3 degree Celsius increase in temperature, we're going to have around 24% less wheat and maize production.
While the population is growing.
While the population is growing. And of course, these declining yield crops are going to, of course, decrease access to food, but also they are going to push prices up. So the poorer populations, the more vulnerable populations who are already facing food security risks, they are going to be hit again the hardest.
Very worrying. You're specialized in the effectiveness, in the legitimacy and the ethical and judicial considerations of private and transnational forms of governance in the sustainability domain. That's quite a mouthful. What does that exactly mean?
Well, this means that I'm interested not only in what governments are doing, so what they are deciding in these intergovernmental meetings, in the COP26 and so on, but what the private sector is doing, what businesses are doing, what philanthropists are doing, what civil society organizations are doing, and how can they match what governments are doing or maybe impede what governments are trying to do.
Right. And justice or a just system, that is very important. And if you look at just or what justice would be in a planetary context, it's not something that we're used to. What does that mean?
Yes, so we used to think about justice in a very particular way. So, of course, justice is a very old issue. It's 1,000 years old, so philosophers have grappled with what is justice for a very, very long time. But today we find that we are short of these explanations about justice, which tend to be about distribution, tend to be about procedures, how can we participate inclusively, which are very, very important, but they tend to exclude non-humans. And that's why today we started to speak about planetary justice. So the idea that we are interconnected with the rest of the planet. We are not at the center. And so we have to think what exactly this means. What does it mean to talk about multi-species justice? And what is the role of humans in inducing justice in the planet?
Right. And in the Anthropocene, everything was focused around humans and their needs. And you state as well that humans take up too much space. Yes. Not only humans, but also what humans need to provide food. So stock, animals take up a lot of space as well.
Yeah.
What I was wondering while I was listening to Joost's introduction, but also listening to you, do you still believe that the 3.2 warming of the Earth is something that we can push back? Or is that the reality that we have to deal with, which causes us to realize that food is being more scarce and not available to everybody? What scenario in your head prevails?
Well, I would like the scenario to prevail that we can do something about it, because if we believe that we cannot do anything about this, my fear is we're going to introduce these geoengineering technologies, which is kind of a nightmare, I think. So solar engineering and so on, which are some of the solutions that are being pushed as we talk about the urgency that we are facing and the magnitude of the challenge. So I don't want us to go to that direction. I want us to still work with the belief that we can still do something. And of course we have to adapt. We have to take this into account. But we still have to push forward efforts for ambitious climate action.
Right. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Dark Matters Lab have also prepared some questions for you, so you will have a discussion with them as well. But first, I would like to introduce our next guest. Giulio Cuadro is Head of Innovation at the United Nations Development Programme. A warm welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
As Head of Innovations at UNDP, what is your main responsibility?
Well, UNDP is the UN development agency. We are working in around 170 countries. And my job is really to work with our country offices in all these countries and work with the governments, both at the national and local level, to talk about innovation. And innovation is often associated with speed, with the rate of things happening faster. We are actually asking a different type of questions of innovation, which is around direction. So can you actually direct your innovation efforts to reduce inequality, to improve sustainability, to improve the condition of the environment? So it's really about thinking about how do you build opportunities and political will to not to fall into a trap of, for example, geoengineering that was just mentioned, right, in terms of a quick solution or any similarly technocratic solution, what are really difficult and complex political and social issues.
Right. Well, we've discussed some changes as well, some systemic changes in order to have a better future. But what we see is that we have to deal with the old, with the classic economy which is built on growth. If you work together with governments, are they willing to change that system around, that to not have growth as the leading factor into deciding what success is? What is your experience in that?
I think it really depends. So first of all, governments are not a monolith, right? So we do tend to think about them as all having, one will or one big behemoth that thinks in the same way. Reality is governments are made of many different levels, very different agendas, many different people with a different type of interests. So one has to find, well, it's true that often the dominant paradigm is really dominated by growth. It's also true that there are many opportunities often to find champions, to find advocates, to find people who are willing to explore different alternative options and have this conversation. And I think the more the problems that you're discussing become stark, you probably see kind of a vicious circle, right? So people feel like they need to provide solutions. They need to provide them yesterday because they are under an incredible amount of pressure from their constituencies. And some of these changes are becoming so dramatic and so obvious oftentimes that, pictures are in the news, which creates more pressure to deliver solutions, etc. And so governments feel often trapped. And in this situation, what happens is that technology fixes seem to be like the easy way out, right? Something that can give you something immediate to answer this appetite for change. But you do also have, and if you're able to portray to a decision maker that there are other options, that these options actually are able to provide alternatives to the dominant growth paradigm, but you can actually create space to explore alternatives. And I think what we're often lacking is both imagination in some way, often to think about these alternatives, and secondly, the ability to create the space and the political will to have a dialogue about what are alternative options that don't keep us stuck in this vicious circle, in this negative feedback loops that we've been discussing at the beginning.
Yeah, because what I also understood is that sometimes solutions are not effective enough, or they're only single point issue solutions. What do you mean by that?
I think there are some dramatic examples. If you go back to Louis Mumford, the urbanist, right, in 1950s, I think already said that, trying to solve traffic congestion by building new lanes of highways is like trying to cure obesity by loosening your belt, right? It's this idea that you can create again this solution that on surface seem to be an immediate fix, but actually perpetuate this vicious loop. So, for example, I live in Asia, and as was mentioned, I think at the beginning, Asia has 99 out of 100 most cities at risk in the world at the moment when it comes to climate and weather risks. So if you take, for example, a city like Jakarta that has unfortunately the water level is going down quite dramatically, the city is literally sinking, and the logical solution from many respects would seem to build a massive wall, right, which is what is happening. So it's this big infrastructural projects. Problem is, the more people keep pumping water from a ground, which means the city continues to sink. The sea water is supposed to rise. The rivers are polluted, which means that people cannot take the water from the rivers and again tap into the groundswell. And so you can see that what seems like a solution with big infrastructure project is unlikely to stand, to be a solution for the long term. Maybe for a few years it will stand, but then actually, unfortunately, it's all the feedback loops that we discussed before again probably means that the city is doomed to sink. And again, the people who are going to be more affected are the people who are poor and cannot afford to move to different locations. So you can see how, again, a single point solution, thinking that you can solve something which is ultimately about changing decisions, changing power relations, changing inequality patterns, cannot be simply fixed by an infrastructure project, just like you cannot fix traffic by adding new lanes to a highway.
Yes, exactly. And in the example of Jakarta, you can just take up everything and move the capital of the city to another island where that problem isn't happening yet, which is not the right solution either. There's more questions I have for you. I hope we can continue our conversation later, because I would like to talk to you as well about the complexity of all taking every aspect into account and finding solutions that deal with all the different kinds of aspects. But first, I would like to give the floor to Dark Matter's Lab to continue the conversation with Agni and with Giulio. Joost and Indy, the floor is yours.
Sure. And I have a first question to Agni, which is about the scenario you sketch, right? About growing food insecurity and uneven impacts of food insecurity as a key global risk. Now, could you elaborate on what that could potentially mean for cities? Right? Because, of course, cities are highly sophisticated systems, right? Highly sophisticated systems that through logistics, a wide range of contracts, price signals, behavior patterns, etc., sustain a degree of civility and an ability for people to live their lives and care for what they find important. Right. So how vulnerable are the particularities of this sophisticated system to a change in our ability to provide food security? And do you think that they actually become a trap? Potentially, rather than providing security and an ability to improve your life, which is why people have always gone to cities, is there a risk, in your view, that they become a trap where the rich escape and actually there's a future of social unrest and a breakdown of systems? I'm curious how you see that risk and what that means for how we think of designing cities in the future.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this question, because as we know, the world is becoming increasingly urbanized. And so we are going to live in the cities mostly. And that, of course, has huge implications about how population in the cities is going to feed themselves. And we know already that food access in the cities is also very stratified. So it's quite an old story that we have food deserts, for instance, which means that people have not access to nutritious food. So they have access to cheap food, but not access to nutritious food. And this is likely to increase in the future, especially because climate change, next to the availability challenges that I mentioned before, is also going to likely reduce the nutrient level of food that we have. So it's then likely, especially that poorer populations are going to be pushed into a higher intake of even less nutritious food. And we also see with the COVID pandemic, for instance, that around, I think, 80 million people have been pushed more into food insecurity. And so we see that as, you know, what could happen when this increase in the temperature is going to hit us really hard. So we face this kind of doom future in some respect, but there are also a number of initiatives that are taking place in a way that could counter the challenges that we're facing, if I may talk about that. So, for instance, we have short supply chains as perhaps an alternative to the globalized system of food production. And these community-supported agriculture or municipal food movements, they are potential innovations that are already taking place. They are currently taking place in niches, but could potentially provide a solution to the concerns that we are facing. But these kind of initiatives right now are quite conceived as elitist. So they are quite expensive, so the products that they are offered, and we cannot have a transition that is based on of an elitist idea because it will never succeed. And so sustainability, environmental sustainability has to go together with justice, as we have been talking. It needs to be also inclusive, it needs to be fair, and it needs to be just. These two pillars have to be reconciled for us to successfully address these challenges
Have you got
in the
scenarios
city.
and to make it more just, or how can you make it more inclusive and less elitist?
Yes. Well, first of all, let me say something about scale. So these initiatives try to recalibrate the distance between the production and the consumption. And so by doing that, they bring together or closer the farmer with the consumer. And this could also be a way to provide more stability and more to the farmers when consumers, for instance, pay upfront prices for the farmers, etc. But it's not enough if it remains individualized. So this is also where state comes in and governmental actors, that they can support and nurture this kind of innovations and this kind of transitions.
Can I come in on
Sure.
this? I think it's in 2008, I think we had riots in 60 countries, 60 cities around the world, as a result of food prices mobilizing. And we know that the 5 major food baskets, as you pointed out, are all at risk. And you don't have to get to 3 degrees. 1.8, 1.9 degrees, they start to destabilize. Actually, we don't have to wait for food basket failure. We have to just wait for it to destabilize, so we have risks. And I suppose one of the questions is, compared to the size and scale of those risks, do we think we have the right scale of solutions married up to those risks? Mm-hmm. And I really liked your point about the kind of, there's one thing about saying about nutrition justice in a way, mm-hmm. and then there's calorific justice. And the likelihood is we might be able to get to calorific justice, but we're pretty unlikely to get to nutrition justice right now. Mm-hmm. in any format. So we'll if push comes to shove, and in a way, food is one of those state systems that you don't need to do much, and it destabilizes democracy and frameworks very quickly, as we found in 2008. And we know, even some of the Syria crisis was actually relocated into climate change effects into rural landscapes and the shift of farming off that back. So there's kind of cascading effects.
Right.
How do we start to have kind of, a new type of conversation between the kind of criticality of these systems, beyond the kind of monetary criticality, to the kind of social, societal risks that they generate in a real way? Because in a way, the fluctuation of food prices can destabilize whole society very quickly. How do we start to have that sort of scale of conversation mm-hmm. that's necessary in that future?
Yes, so let me say something about the price fluctuation, because of course all the challenges that are manifesting in the food system are very complex. And part of this has to do with the financialization of agriculture. It's agriculture, is open to investment to any kind of investor that wants to diversify their portfolio. And they have nothing to do with food. It's just another commodity. So as food became commodified, and as is just, another, derivative in the financial market, then we have also, these types of instabilities. in the food system. So it's not just, of course, climate change, and it's the entire way the system operates, the economic system and the political system. And the solutions that are currently being offered, in a way, it's business as usual. So it's you know, having goals, having targets, which are good things, but we don't shift the debate. And I think we have to change the discourse. We have to what is the important thing that we are talking about? And how do we actually perceive food? What is our relationship to food? We have, you know, food sovereignty movements. We have solidarity food movements. What do they have to offer? What do they bring to the table? And what demands do they make? And then, you know, talk about this perspective as well, and not just the perspective from intergovernmental organizations like the World Trade Organization or the financial organizations that in a way are responsible, I think, for what we're facing right now.
Can I go to Giulio as well? Because I wonder, if we talk about solutions, what Indy asked, do we have enough solutions for the problem that we're facing with the destabilizing food situation because of prices or other circumstances? What is your take on that, Giulio?
I think the solutions might be there. What is not there, or at least partially the beginning of the solutions, what seems to me is often not there is a way to generate a dialogue that fundamentally is not about producing incremental improvements on the current system, but actually starts reimagining different systems altogether. And so in that sense, I think it's really difficult to shift the conversation. And often what is happening is that for perfectly legitimate reason, the conversation turns out to be a very confrontational one, trying to go head on head on issues of principle, of strong beliefs around how a current system works or is not working. And that's obviously extremely needed. You need that type of activism. But, you know, I think the lesson of history, you've probably seen this book called Obliquity from John Kay, is that often some of these big changes are not happen by tackling issues or naming them in a very direct way, but actually changing in a subtler way relationships on the side and interplay between different players. And I'm wondering, what can we actually do if you take an issue like food, to start thinking about where are opportunities to create a very different type of dialogue, which is not necessarily on that oppositional confrontational level, but tries to create spaces in intermediary areas where there may be more an opportunity for dialogue in different ways. You know, just to give you an example, we are have a project in the south of Thailand at the moment that is actually looking at food as an opportunity for economic growth and reconciliation in an area where there's been quite a lot of conflict and tension between different types of communities. And the common ground in this case is food, and one what is actually but the issue at stake is really lack of trust between different types of communities. But the common ground is in food, and having a conversation on that level opens up new opportunities to actually rethink the current situation of the way it is stuck. So to me, an interesting question is, are there other oblique strategies to actually start raising the conversation? Because often, because of the financial and political interests that keep a current system where it is very difficult to open up a dialogue on the more direct terms. And I think it requires some smart activism to actually think of what are alternative opportunities.
Right. Thank you so much. Can I just have two more questions for India, Agni? Agni and then Giulio, and then I'll flip over to you. Is that okay? Agni, what we heard is, that was mentioned before as well. we need a change of systems. We need to see the alternatives, and that discourse, like Giulio also admits, is changing very slowly. And what is the reason? Why is our behavior changing so slowly? Has it got anything to do with the cognitive dissonance that was mentioned earlier?
Yes, and you find that at different levels. So if you take, for instance, the level of the individual, ourselves, and we take again the example of food, of course, and with a meat consumption. So meat is one of the great contributors to climate change, to biodiversity loss, and also has adverse effect on animal welfare and human health if it is, overly consumed. So we know all these things. At the same time, we see, of course, certain efforts to shift to vegetarianism or veganism, as well as we have innovations like meat analogs, so products that try to mimic meat in order to, attract consumers, etc. But still, we face, I think, a cultural incumbency. We need a sort of a sense-making of different types of products that we used to have at the level of a pedestal, like the meat is a superior product and the plant-based products are just inferior. So we need to change this kind of perception around
How do you
food.
do that? How do we change the minds of people in that sense?
It's very difficult on the one hand because throughout history, meat has been associated with status and wealth. And also we use meat in ritual ways, like we have celebratory meals, Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, and they are all associated with different types of meat eating and meat cooking. So it's very much ingrained in our culture. But it's not only in the celebratory meals, in the Western diets at least. So it has become part of our everyday lives, and that's where the problem comes in. But at the same time, I think we see from the younger generation at least, a shift towards alternatives.
Is it just a matter of time that as soon as the younger generation get into power, that mind shift towards meat, for example, will happen automatically? Or is it something that we should endorse actively as well?
We should endorse it actively. And I think the younger generation is concerned about not only their health and not only the ethos where the early vegetarians were concerned about, which was mostly about animal welfare, but they are concerned about climate change, they are concerned about biodiversity loss, so they have bigger concerns. And we see certain trends, like in the UK, it is projected that by 2025, 1/4 of the population will be vegetarians. So, and that's not very far away. No. So we are in 2021. So we see this shift happening in certain countries. And of course, it needs active nurturing and active push towards that
stimulation, so to speak.
Yes.
Giulio, you talked about activism, that activism can be a force to reckon with in order to change. But what I also wonder is that, is governance not broken? I mean, is that system that we're in concerning governance, does that still function? And if not, how can we change that?
Yeah, so this is at the moment a very hot topic, because as you probably, as you've seen it, with COVID, the perceptions around governments around the world have shifted in many different twists and turns, right? So at one point, the level of trust had really increased because some governments have been seen to be particularly effective with the COVID response, and in some other cases, the opposite has been the case. But it reminded certainly everybody, and I think there's, if you look at across the world, there is much more a sense now that really when push came to shove, it was the public sector that was expected to bear the brunt of pandemic response more than anything else. And so I think there's been a really interesting shift in perception, certainly much more appetite now for government activism in terms of actually shaping the direction, for example, of industrial policy, a call for being green recovery, and also rethinking maybe even industrial policy and addressing some of the issues that we discussed around, for example, around food. So I think there is an interesting turning of a tide there in terms of actually accepting that government has a role to play. I think the interesting question is going to be, can the will be really generated and maintained? So if you look at where, for example, many of the recovery packages for COVID have gone, there's very few governments that really, at the end, stuck to a promise for a green coming back, right, a new normal. And really the question that you're asking to me is one of how can actually, so the capacities are there. The question is how do one build the political pressure and continues to believe it to put pressure so that certain decisions that really call for a very different way of doing things actually can happen. You've seen the deal on taxation that just happened this week, maybe, right? So there are opportunities. The question is, can actually one harness them and keep the window of opportunity open long enough that it starts tackling some of these strong held beliefs and paradigms that you heard.
What is your question? What is the answer to that question? Are we able to keep that window open and really bring about change? Or are we going back to the old normal?
Well, I think there's millions of opinions about this at the moment, right? I think the interesting question is how can we organize ourselves as societies to actually being able to do it? And again, I don't see this necessarily as a, one against the other. I think there is actually, as I said, I do think there are people who are really genuinely concerned in decision-making positions to actually take the right decision at the moment. The question is how do I actually find them, empowers them, and allows them to have a different type of dialogue with private sector, with communities, to actually being able to open up a space for them to do it. The other thing which I think we need to continue doing, and it's very, very difficult to do, but keep reminding and asking very tough questions about who is being left behind and who has not the option of, for example, changing their food habits, or who has not the option of having access to alternatives to what is currently available to them. And if we keep asking these questions and putting issues of inequality really at the front of the agenda, hopefully we can continue to maintain the attention on issues that have become really, really apparent during COVID pandemic.
Right. Thank you so much for now, Giulio. Indy, I rudely interrupted your question. Can I please give you the floor again to ask your questions to both of our guests?
No, not at all. I suppose, Giulio, I think the kind of oblique point is really interesting. And I suppose I want to start with, does oblique work now? And if you actually look at the theory of change, you would argue that wars have been the fundamental moment where actual structural changes occurred. And we are already in a situation like war, which we choose not to talk about as a war. We are fundamentally destroying the future for many, many generations. And I wonder whether there's, in a way, our inability to talk about the scale of damage we're doing to future generations and our ability to recognize that as almost a form of future genocide of people and animals that live and non-human systems that live is part of the problem. And simultaneously, what we have to recognize is that cities are they're an implied order. They're an implied order sitting on logistics and other infrastructure. So food systems, you make food systems vulnerable, cities fall apart. You make energy and biomaterial systems vulnerable, cities will fall apart. And our city formation, as it's currently formed, is sitting on very old industrial globalized optimizations, which are actually becoming fragile. And I suppose the kind of purpose of this talk and the purpose of this kind of series of conversations that we want to have is that actually there's a moment to start facing some real truths that if we don't face, we will actually open up our cities to some real structural vulnerabilities, which will not necessarily manifest directly first time around in Europe. They might manifest in other parts of the world. But we know those are cascading effects. We already know the global migration implications of if we end up with anywhere near the temperature warming that we've seen, wet bulb temperatures of 35 degrees starts to kill people, we know that actually climate migration becomes significant. And that climate migration will destabilize adjacent countries and other things. And I suppose one of the questions for me is, like, in that situation, how do we start to really talk about deep transformation and structural transformation at the level of actually our places that we live and the systems to which they're absolutely vulnerable to? And recognizing, you know, if we're talking about Amsterdam, let's use it as an example. If we're talking about Amsterdam, we can't just talk about Amsterdam. We have to talk about Amsterdam and the systems to which it's vulnerable to. And we want to talk about transition. We're going to have to talk about the systems, the metabolic flows and systems of Amsterdam to which we have to make these transitions, whether energy, water, food systems, all the other things that are associated with it, all the way through human systems. We know that there's going to be associated effects of that. So I suppose it's in that context, I suppose I open up we come back to the conversation, that it feels like we're still tinkering around the edges, respectfully. And if you had a magic wish, what would you guys do? Because I think, in a way, we've all been playing around the edges. If you could say, Giulio, if you could say, right, actually, I want a 100 billion program for innovation at UN, what would that be? What's the thing that starts to deal with it? Do we think we're adequately resourced in our current approaches and adequately structured in our current approaches to be able to deal with the scale of the challenge? We know the European Commission is putting down 200 billion for the transformation of cities in the European Union. Yet, to retrofit one city like Sofia will cost 25 billion. So even we know that's not even the right scale of money to be able to deal with it. And it's not all about money. Money is just an indicative resource. So I suppose just opening that back up, I mean, if you had a magic wand, what would be that magic wand right now? What tool would you like to have?
Giulio, can I ask you to respond to that first?
Yeah, just to give me the easy question, Indy. I think there's, to me, at least a couple of things. So first of all, let me just start with your premise, right? I do think that part of the question is, is a famous, we're entering the second half of a chessboard type of problem, right? So, a story of a guy who invented the chess and the emperor, I think, of India, right? Basically asked him, what do you want back, right? So it was, and he said, I want one grain of rice for each part of a chess, and then it needs to be doubled in the next one. And of course, the emperor said, yeah, fantastic. And then, of course, when you add it all up, this becomes sending bankrupt, right? And I think part of a problem when you're saying, we cannot conceive a scale of these issues. What does it mean to live in a world where one day out of 3 is going to be a day of extreme weathers, right? So part of the question is we can literally not conceive this question. And I think that using, no matter what extreme words we use, no matter what apocalyptic scenario we use, I don't think that is the way to achieve a change. Or rather, we need to keep talking about it. But as you know, there's plenty of evidence that there seems to be a level of tolerance above which just painting apocalyptic scenarios is actually turns people off. Or we also generate things like climate anxiety and quite a people getting into depression. So there's one question around that. Now, one thing that I think would be concrete, so if you ask me my magic wand about where things maybe, one can start to generate quite different type of questions and possibly behavioral change, is to make many of these systems that you're talking about less opaque. And so I think it's actually extremely difficult if you're, even today, if you're buying food, if you're picking your electricity, if you're using the internet, to really understand what are the feedback loops that you generate by using these systems, and where does your electricity come from, where does all these other things, infrastructure ends up to, all this level of opacity makes it really difficult, I think, to having a conversation about where our current systems are currently stuck, let alone the financial flows, right? All these type of things behind it. And so if you ask me, if we were able to have a much higher level of transparency of these systems, maybe we can start generating a different type of discussion, and perhaps more importantly, a much higher level of distributed action. Because if you want that type of scale of transformation that you're talking about, this is not going to go centralized top-down. It needs to be distributed in many different ways. And I think being able to have that type of immediate feedback loop between the action that you do and the things that you can actually change maybe can enable action distributed across the world.
Great, thank you so much.
Giulio, can I just follow up on that? And then,
yeah, okay. We were a little bit strapped on time, so I would really like to give you the opportunity as well to wave your magic wand.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I agree with some of the things that Giulio mentioned. So the temporal management is an issue because our human time and even more our political time does not match the geological time. And our institutions have not been designed actually to think in that way, to think in millions of years of all the changes that have been happened. And we take for granted that we are in this earth and we own this earth. It's not the case. So we should actually discenter this idea that we are the center and the earth has been created for us, etc. But for me, one of the key issues is how the entire food system, for instance, if we talk about food again, is structured, and there is a huge concentration of the food system. And I think we can do something about that. We have very few firms that control what's happening, control seeds. We have only 4 firms that control the entire seed production and chemicals. And so they have a huge influence, these firms, on what is happening. And in the political process, they can also influence the discourse, etc. So I think breaking this huge concentration of the food system is something that I would like to see happening. And the other thing that I would like to see happening is policies that address the rich, because we know that the most significant determinant if we talk about individuals, a person's footprint is their income, and yet we don't see policies that really address how the rich lifestyles in a way. So I would definitely, and I think we can do something both about these things.
Great. Indy, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, no, it actually builds on both points. So I suppose I agree with the transparency bit, definitely. However, and I think, Agnes, I think you were bringing this in, we know that actually 40% of Americans, let's use Americans as a datum, are living about $400 away from being actually losing their home or a significant event. That's the sort of scale of precarity. When you introduce a large democratic population, which is highly precarious, the decision-making capability to make those advanced decisions actually is impaired. And we know this. Economic recessions impair people's decisions. They change what you buy, how you buy. So in a way, one of the challenges for democracy is that we have not created the democratic landscape, the cognitive democratic landscape, because we built an economic engine which is driving precarity. Yet we want democratic decisions. We want people to make decisions on that framework. So it feels like our context is not able to make those decisions. So there seems to be a social covenant problem for me at the back end of this, that unless we can build a social covenant actually that allows for those, that creates this context for those cognitive decisions, and then the radical transparency sits on top of that, then you have a pathway into this process. Right. And this goes as an open question. So I think, how do we build a social covenant to allow, exactly as you're saying, the 4 seed companies are basically controlling through political affairs and other things, actually the choice architectures of people, directly or indirectly. You're mute, yes.
Right. We've almost come to the end of the program. Unfortunately, this hour flew by very quickly. But to close things off, I would like to ask you, the title of the program, of course, is Transitioning Together. What was laid out today were the problems that we're facing, and we hinted on some solutions. But if you would like to have the transition for us all, to have it inclusive, and have everybody take part in that transition, what do we need? I'd like to ask you all to have very fairly short answer into this difficult question. So I know it's a contradiction that I'm confronting you with. But Agni, can I start with you? Transitioning together, what do we need in order to bring that about? Not only for the lucky few or not for the elitists.
I think we need to get rid of the belief that technological innovation alone is going to get us out of the problem, and to acknowledge that the planet no longer belongs to the human dominant order.
Right. That we should take non-humans in account when we decide and create policies for the future, and take future generations into account as well. Giulio, can I ask you the same question?
I think I'll take in this provocation and say we do need a new social contract, and we need to really be fairly adamant that we need to have a future where really no one is left behind, and that cannot be something that we can live in any way as a second thought or an afterthought. And when I mean anyone, I also mean other species and other that inhabit this planet. It's not only humans.
Yes, thank you so much. Indy, the same question for you. You already talked about the social covenant, and in order to change that and make it more fair and just, is there something else that we need in order to bring about change for all? Oh, your sound is off. Is that?
I'll give just a quick response, and I'll leave space for Joost. I would recommend everyone read Ministry for the Future. I think this should be the new Bible. Everyone should have read it.
And why is that?
Because I think it constructs many of the theoretical narratives that we talk about and constructs them into real possible pathways that we are very much heading along. And it shows the implications. And I think it will change our cognitive space of operation. And I think it certainly has done for me. When you read it, you see a different cognitive space of operation. Right. And I think we seem to be locked into a cognitive space, which I think needs challenging. So I really... that would be my one small intervention.
Right, and then we'll round it off. Your biggest takeaway from that book, what was that?
It's like I sort of was framing, and I think it's the seriousness of it all, right? So in one event in that book, which I don't want to spoil, I mean, it's a very straightforward, one event in that book is 20 million Indians die over a week as a result of a heat wave. And when you put that sort of catastrophic event, it changes the socio-political cognitive space of the whole world. And I think when you look at the pathways we're on and the way, I mean, the author explores them, which I think is done with great elegance. I don't think it's the best writing in the world, but it's still very elegant. I think it changes our perception of the future. And I think it's really important. It's like Star Trek changed perceptions of futures. I think, Ministry of the Future changes our perception of the future. And we need to work with it. We need to work with that reality.
Right, Minister of the Future. We will read that book as well. Joost, final words from you. You started the program with a gloom future scenario for the future. What is your biggest takeaway from tonight, and what does it mean to transitioning to have the transition together?
So I think a lot of really important things were said by Agni and Giulio. And my takeaway hopefully combines their points. And one of the starting points is that we need a much higher level of distributed action if this transition is going to happen en masse, right? Because I think both Agni and Giulio mentioned examples of change and new contexts and examples that are inspiring, but we can't live off and certainly can't transition off beautiful exceptions, right? So one thing that I think we need to do is understanding the design in designing cities for all, in designing the settings and the processes through which good people can be empowered, like Giulio said, settings in which different kind of cultural notions around food can be imagined, discussed, narrated, re-narrated, and practiced. Obviously, food is not just about stories; it's also about eating. It's about creating these settings in which the transition can be figured out together. And I think it's really interesting that cities are often actually really reluctant, for example, to talk about food systems change. It's like it's national governments, international stuff. It's nothing to do with us. So we focus on transport, energy, etc. But actually, municipalities can, and in cities we can create those kind of settings for new practices and new debates and new imaginations to happen. And I think that is a critical design challenge for those settings to be inclusive, for those settings and for the institutions connected to them to be inclusive, well-resourced, and able to deal with complexity. That has to do with transparency of information, that has to do with people being able to interrogate complexity, people being able to share stories, people being able to share fears, and then figure out ways forward. And these new settings for a new imagination to take place, I think that is one of the core urban design questions that we're facing. And that's one that we also look forward to exploring over the next 2 sessions.
Great. Thank you so much, Joost. Unfortunately, time is up. Thank you, Giulio. Thank you, Sina. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for that roundup as well. Like Joost said, this is only the first part of the triptych. Next, we will be back with this second part. And hopefully you can join us as well. We're going to explore the crucial question next week. How can we transition in ways that are genuinely inclusive in a diverse and unequal world? And we touched on that as well, but we dive into that a bit deeper next week. If you are a student and a designer to be, please join our book club, our student book club. You can find information about the student book club on the website, and that's dezwijger.nl/book club. And you can get a copy of The Precipice as well. The Precipice is the book that is selected by Joost and Indy, and the deadline for getting the book and being involved in the student book club is June 18th. And of course, you can check our website. There you can find the programs that have been happening in the past, but you can also see what's going to happen in future. And on the website, you can also find the opportunity to support us in these difficult times. There's a pay-as-you-like button where you can leave the donations, and donations will directly go to the programs as well. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see each other next week. Bye-bye.